about when kids shows become a bit more serious or meta? It's one of many things that can make an adult viewer rewatch something, maybe grow up caring about something, make a whole niche YouTube channel about that something. And it's one of many things that keep me and many others caring about a certain children's show about talking trains. Thomas is known for being mature for what it actually is, but I don't want to talk about that in this video. There have been several videos I've made talking about those mature tones, deeper context, all in different episodes I found either special or more appealing. It's not something you have to look far for, depending on the season you're watching. So let's take things off the beaten path a little bit. Instead of talking about what makes this silly, colorful show mature, of all things, let's talk about the time it was downright terrifying. You may remember my video on Put Upon Percy, a personal favorite episode series-wide of mine that I loved for not only being more serious, but also for having those and being a Percy-centric episode. You could guess that a similar thing is at play here, but that's not something I even have to tell you. I'd argue it goes a step further here, even. Percy's Ghostly Trick, or Ghost Train, is a story that, like many others, started in the Railway series books. Both play out largely the same. And for those who need a refresher, the story goes sorta like this. Percy finds himself in the yards with Thomas and Toby. He tells them a ghost story, one about his driver, who had apparently seen one the night before, something Thomas finds silly and quickly calls out. Percy is made to feel even more so when his driver explains that he wasn't being serious the next day. In fact, that came from TV. It's later that evening, when Percy is returning from the harbor, that he becomes a bit of a ghost, after running into a lime cart that was left on the tracks. Percy actually cares about railway safety, so he rushes to the nearest signal box to give them a heads up. It's here he meets Toby as well. It's suggested Percy gets a cleanup, being told he looks like that of a ghost. But this gives Percy an idea instead. He relays such to Toby, and the two set off to scare Thomas back at the sheds. Toby shows up in a panic, only to tell Thomas about a horrible accident, one that Percy just found himself in. Thomas ends up somewhat concerned, if at all, about Percy, but more is concerned this will make him late when he's heading up the line. Toby tells Thomas that he saw something that looked like Percy's ghost, and it was coming there. But Thomas, presumably being pretty doubtful, shrugs it off, instead reassuring Toby that there's nothing to worry about and he will protect him. Just then, Percy arrives. Thomas watches in horror as the shed doors open and reveals what he thinks is the spirit of Percy. He's shaken, unsure of what to say, so instead he remarks about Annie and Clarabelle, and quickly rushes out of the sheds. He's so scared, in fact, he doesn't return to the sheds for the entire rest of the night. It's the next day when Toby finds Thomas in a bit of a panic, and of course wants to know where he's been. Thomas explains he spent the night in the goods shed to give Toby some grieving space, only for Percy's whistle to echo through the yard, scaring Thomas again. He makes another excuse and quickly hurries off, right as Percy arrives explaining he heard everything. Both he and Toby agree it's as if Thomas had just seen a ghost. And to be fair to Thomas, he kinda did. From the very beginning of this episode, literally the first cue, you're hip to the fact this isn't a normal episode. The atmosphere is instantly different, much darker, and even in scenes with daylight present, there's a sort of mystique to it, especially in the beginning few shots where they flooded the set with smoke. I'm basically saying that atmosphere is unique to this episode. The show knew this would be the scary episode and really went all in. Set-wise, it doesn't end there either. In fact, look at every shot of Percy running at night, and I bet you'll see what I'm saying. When returning from the harbor, Percy is surrounded by leafless trees, mist, darkness. We're told ghosts don't exist in the opening few lines of dialogue, but this atmosphere is not reassuring. Toby and Percy are really the only positive-leaning interactions we see in the entire episode, when both agree to scare Thomas. And I say that for largely Thomas himself in this episode. This is not the Thomas you may be familiar with. He starts with telling Percy he and his co-story is silly, then finding out Percy is literally dead, only to be annoyed at the prospect of being late because of it. When Percy's ghost does show up, he's not much better either, still not showing much care for the situation, and ultimately deciding to simply shed elsewhere. Sure, at this point he's scared out of his wits, but not because his friend is hurt. Hell, he even tells Toby it's to give him room, only to scurry off again when he thinks the Spectre is soon to return. At some point, it becomes hard to tell we're talking about the squeaky clean blue engine that Mattel loves to parade, like a steam-puffing angel. But in my opinion, he was never supposed to be. Thomas is cheeky. He's a bit more on the arrogant side. Don't take that as me saying I like this Thomas more, as it's definitely a bit much, but it definitely swings more at that accurate portrayal, I'd say. This Thomas only really cares about getting his work done, and maybe realizes that a single engine breaking down, or worse, can't really stop the cogs of a railroad machine. In fact, he's only sympathetic to that. I'll leave it up to you to decide if that's really the better or more accurate Thomas. Either way, it's worth the highlight here. Let's take a step back to the main character, Percy. Percy takes up every main role we'd typically see Thomas take here. Now, that alone doesn't make this episode special, but how they play out such definitely does. This is not the Percy and Thomas duo we see today. They're not really best friends here. It's highlighted pretty well that Percy is closer to Toby, if anything. This is a time before that. Percy goes from being the silly little engine, a much more sympathetic role, to a terrifying and stark reminder to Thomas of his own mortality. But does Percy ever really leave the first, being that sympathetic character? In my opinion, no. We as the audience get to see the entire thing play out. We see Percy hit the lime cart. We see him form the plan with Toby. In a way, I feel like I had to be on that page for this story to work. I wouldn't call Thomas an antagonist, but in this story, he seems to fit the bill. And we care to see that comeuppance, as at some point we all agree it's deserved. A good scare would serve him right, and Percy and Toby are more than willing to give it to him. What's more scary or uncomfortable than thinking you know a character or person, only to find out it's a little more complex than that? And what episode has done this better? And it's for that non-hero-esque, very rude Thomas, unmatched atmosphere, anti-hero Percy, and honestly, personal memories of being terrified of this VHS helps me say there will never be another episode like Ghost Train ever again. Thanks for watching.
Either subscribe, donate, or get the fuck out.